Claude Lorraine was born in the early 1600s in the Duchy of Lorraine. His family were peasants, and he received little formal education. He journeyed to Rome when very young and trained as a decorative fresco painter, specializing in perspective effects. At this time, Rome was the center of interest in new varieties of landscape painting. Artists from northern Europe, such as Spaneveld, were attracted by the Roman ruins and popularized small pictures in which the decaying grandeur of ancient monuments is contrasted with vivid vignettes of contemporary life. Others, like Gottfried Valls, created a more idyllic and lyrical mood. Claude became friends with these artists, and his earliest pictures share their interests. The view of Rome with the Trinità dei Monti, probably painted from Claude's rooftop on the Via Margutta, shows an accurate view of the 16th century church, the Trinità dei Monti, and the Palazzo Zucchero. On the skyline, we see the papal Palazzo del Quirinale. The foreground scene, though, is imaginary. A procuress taking money was a favourite theme with northern artists. Dark classical columns framed the distant sunlit view. In this picture, Claude surpassed his contemporaries in the freshness and truthfulness of light and atmosphere. Underlying such effects is his passionate interest in drawing from nature. He conveyed the impression of brilliant sunlight by the contrast between deep brown washes and the brightness of untouched paper. The beauty of this drawing lies in its bold surface pattern of shape, graceful line, dark and light. Paintings such as Landscape with an Imaginary View of Tivoli are indebted to Claude's drawings. The effects of light, shining through the edges of the trees, are intensely naturalistic. The site is Tivoli, whose beauty had been celebrated since antiquity. The Temple of the Sibyl crowns the gorge of the Anio with its plunging cascades. Glittering in the distance is the dome of St. Peter's. Yet the picture is also deeply romantic. The dramatic light suggests the mood of exaltation with which the traveller from northern Europe approached Rome. The picture was perhaps painted as a souvenir for a 17th century grand tourist, steeped in classical culture. The herdsman in the foreground recalls the calm of pastoral life as imagined by ancient poets. The naturalism of Claude's light bewitched his contemporaries. His 17th century biographer, Baldinucci, wrote, The great quality of this artist was a marvellous and still unsurpassed imitation of nature in those of its various aspects which conditioned the views of the sun, particularly on the sea and the rivers at dawn and evening. The effects of the sun are most dazzling in Claude's seaports, a type of picture which he invented. In the seaport with the embarkation of St. Ursula, the Princess Ursula, with her 11,000 virgin companions, embarks on the voyage which leads to her martyrdom from an imaginary port. The eye is drawn to the light of the rising sun, suggesting the wonder and romance of a legendary journey. The atmospheric perspective is of unprecedented naturalism. Ships and their rigging are seen against the light, strong silhouettes against the sky. Claude explored these effects, creating abstract patterns that are both bold and fragile. The blues and pinks of the figures, and above all the gold which distinguishes St. Ursula, pick up and accentuate the colours of sea and sky. The pattern of colours is elaborate and very carefully planned to suggest sunlight diffused through a single unified space, from light background to the dark foreground. For example, the blue of some foreground figures, an expensive ultramarine, is richly saturated. As objects and figures recede, the same colour appears increasingly mixed with white, as in the boatmen's clothing and in the virgins' dresses. It reappears, still paler, on the flags of the boats against the sky. The flags on the right were originally pink and white, but Claude changed them to blue to harmonize the pattern and complete the illusion of gradual recession in space. The early morning sun plays on the variegated surfaces of a stately sequence of palaces and churches. Claude's architecture is adapted from Roman Renaissance buildings. St. Ursula's companions descend the steps of the Tempietto, built by the architect Bramante to mark the spot where St. Peter was martyred, and thus fitting to the subject of a martyr saint. Beyond lies an edifice whose pattern of pilasters recalls the Cancelleria, the most celebrated palace of Renaissance Rome. To the right, the medieval castle, veiled in mist, is derived from the castle of Santa Severa, near Civitavecchia, where Claude had sketched. Its more picturesque outline may be intended to evoke the Gothic countries of northern Europe, through which St. Ursula journeyed. Claude's architectural settings suggest the beauty of ideal cities, yet are brought to life by uniting the imaginary with the real. Claude's early pastorals, such as the National Gallery's landscape with a goat herd, suggest the ideal simplicity of the shepherd's life, which ancient and Renaissance poets contrasted with the turmoil of life at court. Claude sets the light among the trees and creates, as no earlier artist had done, a sense of being immersed in nature. The Latin poet Horace had praised the sweet peace of reclining beneath a tree, where purling brooklets babble, lulling to gentle slumber. The landscape with the marriage of Isaac and Rebecca is more complex. It recalls the beauty of the Roman Campagna and represents the fruits of Claude's many sketching expeditions around Rome. The brilliant blue of the river Tiber is crossed by a bridge reminiscent of the ancient Ponte Molle, which welcomed travellers to Rome. Beyond the Ponte Molle are the Roman aqueducts leading on to distant plains. The Rocca at Tivoli and the tombs that line the Appian Way may have been the inspiration for Claude's medieval city. The landscape is both near and remote, both real and legendary, and this blend is perhaps the essence of pastoral. The spectator is invited to become an imaginary traveller and to identify with the small figures moving along paths and bridges towards the snow-capped peaks. The flowing river, the turning water wheel, the ruined temple, crumbling tower, and yellowing trees suggest movement and transience. The herdsman in a short tunic, leaning on his staff, so strikingly reminiscent of a Roman relief, and the elegant musicians, with their array of antique silverware, recall the classical world, while the huntsmen and the women and children seem to have wandered in from present reality. The soldiers on the left, who marvel at the pastoral scene, represent a contrasting world of warfare and strife. The device of the framing trees, with the figures arranged as though in the wings of a theatre, heightens the sense of looking at a lost golden age, an ideal Italy, where summer is eternal and mankind and nature dwell in harmony. The picture was paired, as is frequent in Claude, with a seascape, setting the earth against the sea, and the natural beauty of groves and hills against the splendid architecture of man. In this picture, the embarkation of the Queen of Sheba, we can most easily see how the structure of Claude's composition accents the narrative. The canvas is divided into fifths, both horizontally and vertically. The horizon is at 2/5 of the height. The column on the left and the palace on the right each project 1/5 of the width into the composition, and the tower in the distance stands at 2/5 from the right. The vanishing point is at the centre of the horizon, and the small boats and diagonals of the masts lead the eye to the ship that will carry the Queen of Sheba to Solomon. The small figure of the Queen, descending the steps, is emphasized by the column of the palace. In the landscape with the Arch of Titus, now at Longford Castle, architecture is used in conjunction with the pastoral landscape. The foreground suggests the unchanging rhythms of nature, while ancient ruins evoke meditations on transience and mortality. An anthology of Roman ruins, the Arch of Titus, the Colosseum, an aqueduct, and the Ponte Nomentano, have been transposed from their actual locations to an extensive landscape. The Arch of Titus and the Colosseum are still visible from the Forum, once the administrative, religious, and economic centre of the Roman Empire. To a 17th century French viewer, the painting may have aroused memories of Du Bellai's Antiquities of Rome, in which the poet describes, "Ye sacred ruins and ye tragic sites, which only do the name of Rome retain, old monuments, which of so famous sprites the honour yet in ashes do maintain, triumphant arcs, spires, neighbours to the skies, that you to see doth heaven itself appall. Alas, by little ye to nothing fly, the people's fable and the spoil of all." In his mature years, Claude painted a series of more monumental compositions. Like other 17th century artists, he attempted to raise landscape painting from its lowly status as mere decoration, however beautiful or poetic. The David at the Cave of Adullam in the National Gallery, with its breathtaking distance and its emphasis on the stern virtue of the Old Testament leader, suggests the epic grandeur of Old Testament history. The structure of the landscape itself stresses the lofty moral elevation of David and focuses on Claude's new interest in gesture and expression. David sacrificed to God the water which his soldiers had risked their lives to bring to him. The forms of nature themselves are harsher and more rugged than in earlier works, suggesting the result of Claude's sketching expeditions in the countryside around Il Sasso, the great rock to the west of Rome. On the hillside, the city of Bethlehem is given an antique splendour by an array of temples, towers, and pyramids, and at the centre a tower reminiscent of the Roman Torre delle Milizie. This landscape is heroic rather than pastoral, and recalls the French critic Roger de Peel's definition of heroic landscape as a composition of objects which, in their kinds, draw both from art and nature everything that is great and extraordinary in either. The only buildings are temples, pyramids, ancient places of burial, altars consecrated to the divinities, pleasure houses of regular architecture. And if nature appear not there as we every day casually see her, she is at least represented as we think she ought to be. Landscape with the Adoration of the Golden Calf from Manchester City Art Gallery is again an epic theme from Old Testament history, in which brilliant colours have yielded to a more sombre range of greys, greens, and blues. In keeping with the nobler forms of the landscape, in this period Claude aspired to a nobler figure style. The composition and the figures of this picture are derived from Raphael's fresco of the same subject in the Vatican. In the 17th century, Raphael was idolized by classically minded artists, and his figures were synonymous with ideal beauty. From Raphael, Claude created figures whose austere majesty reflects the epic grandeur of the theme, the origins of monotheistic religion. Claude's later pictures increasingly convey the mysterious beauty of a remote and legendary era. In Coast View with Perseus and the Origin of Coral from Holcombe Hall, Perseus has laid the severed head of the snake-haired Gorgon, Medusa, on the seashore, and sea nymphs marvel as her red blood hardens the weed, creating pink coral. The picture is about the very process of metamorphosis. and to evoke its richness and strangeness, Claude has created a dreamland of magical beauty. The sea nymphs, graceful and ethereal, convey a fairy tale enchantment. The magical winged horse, Pegasus, which sprang from the blood of Medusa, gleams palely. In the foreground, a shadowy Perseus, larger than the other figures, washes the blood from his hands. The figures are isolated against the great plains of sea and sky in a composition of daring boldness. The pale disk of the moon hangs in the sea, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. Change and transience are suggested by the play of pale light over the ceaseless ripples of the surface. The rock arch, like coral itself, seems to grow and change as it rises eerily from the sea, its shape echoing the curve of Perseus' back. Claude explored the sea nymph's wandering gestures in a study of great beauty. In this period, Claude was also attracted by the legendary origins of Rome and illustrated several scenes from the story of the Trojan hero, Aeneas, who after the fall of Troy embarked on a long and perilous quest for Italy. The landscape with Aeneas at Delos shows a moment related by Virgil and Ovid. Fugitive ships have brought Aeneas to Delos, an island sacred to Apollo, where Aeneas, his father Anchises, and his son Ascanius are welcomed by Aeneas, king and priest to Apollo, who shows them the holy sites. In the centre are the two trees, a palm and an olive, to which Latona, mother of Apollo, had clung while giving birth to the twin gods, Apollo and Diana. A relief on the building on the right shows Apollo and Diana killing the giant Tityus, who had attempted to rape Latona. The picture, with its cool blue colouring and its newly elegant forms, is evocative of a distant time and place. The transient drama of Aeneas' flight is contrasted with unchanging bucolic peace. The air is transparent, and the trees are feathery against the sky. Slender and attenuated columns of the temples support a delicate dome. The figures, clad like classical statues, are strangely elongated, and the oddity of scale emphasizes the remoteness of the action. They seem the pallid spirits of an earlier, more noble race. The temple was the shrine of Apollo, and here the oracle declared that the sons of Aeneas shall bear rule over the earth's widest bounds. The temple is a variant on the Roman Pantheon, the most celebrated of antique buildings, here restored to its pristine splendor, and symbolizing the future glory of Rome. The perspectival structure underlines the theme of a landscape between past and future. There are two vanishing points, one to the left and the other to the right of the canvas, so that as our eye is drawn to them, we sense that Aeneas has come from a distant land, Troy, and will proceed to another, Italy, and the founding of Rome. In Claude's pictures, past and present blend. His landscapes, so rooted in reality, so rich in picturesque and vivid detail, and brought to life by the most delicate and transient effects of light, poetically evoke the harmony of a lost golden age and the remote splendor of a legendary past.